Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in. Hey, Byrne, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Should we get into Figma and Adobe now? The only reason not to would be if there's anything big that's going to come out next week that would require us to wait.
Yeah, I think usually corporate drama like this, it is just kind of, I guess it's the kind of drama where it's like a breakup where something just slowly dies, not the big conflagration. Like it just seemed like it took longer and longer for the deal to close. It was looking less and less likely, and you need more and more competition regulatory authorities to sign off on it, and it just became clear after a while it was probably not going to happen, or not going to happen in a form where the deal still made sense, which is really too bad. Like thinking back, I went back and looked at some of the coverage of the Figma deal right when it was announced, and one of the things that occurred to me was just we kind of needed it. Like this was about 6 months into the downturn. Depending on exactly how you track it, you could say the downturn started right at the beginning of 2022. Just one of those things where everyone coming into the new year sort of reset expectations, decided growth was a little overdone, inflation was maybe more worth worrying about than they thought, and then to the extent that there was still some optimism in the tech world, the Ukraine invasion got rid of a lot of that. Like people just got started thinking about how there's a whole real world out there, and there are all of these bad things that can happen, and that maybe there's more excitement in industries like oil and fertilizer and firearms rather than in stuff like new fintech, new SaaS, etc. And then in September of 2022, there's this massive deal where a huge tech company gives a very nice exit opportunity to a really hyped growth startup that was probably, would almost certainly not have been able to raise at anything remotely like that valuation that they tried to raise. So, I think that deal helped restore a lot of the optimism to the tech space, and I think probably had a reasonable impact. If you think about companies operating on annual cycles, where they set their new cycle in 2022, and over the course of that year they've done too much hiring relative to attrition because attrition's been tracking way below plan and so on. So their 2023 could have been a pretty bad year for tech hiring, a pretty bad year for investment. But if you have deals like that, it does indicate, there's still a reason to back founders who have a big idea and a really good product and who are going after some huge market. So it was kind of, I guess in that sense, maybe we just need the deal less. Like stocks are close to all-time highs, engineers can get jobs, companies are getting funded. So maybe things are sufficiently back to normal that a company like Figma, it's okay that they didn't get the best conceivable outcome. But I'm sure it's a huge bummer to everyone involved.
Do you think it was the right outcome from a antitrust perspective? Some people saying, duopoly merging into a monopoly, like this the DOJ was set up to do. Like, how do you think about that?
I was thinking about this because I wanted to have a really firm opinion, but what I realized was I have an increasing amount of sympathy for people who are doing antitrust in tech right now, because on the one hand, there are these massive companies that always have really long-term plans. They're always expanding in a lot of different directions, and they're clearly very strategically smart. And you can look back at deals like, hey, Google got Android. That turned out to be pretty important. Hey, Facebook got WhatsApp and Instagram. Turns out that'll matter a lot. Maybe Oculus will actually matter even more depending on how the metaverse goes. But you can look back and say there are all these deals where, knowing what we know now, the deal probably shouldn't have gone through. Like there should have been an independent WhatsApp, an independent Instagram, and Facebook should have just been the big blue app. We were a lot worse for them. Like they wouldn't necessarily be growing now, although you never know what they would have done to Instagram if they hadn't been able to buy it. But it's so at that level, you could say probably more deals got done than antitrust people would normally want to get done. Like our baseline level of competition is lower than it otherwise would have been because of this very clever M&A from the big tech companies. On the other hand, you have to ask, like, why does a company like Instagram get funding in the first place? And one reason is, of course, it was a really good product and people loved it. And, it was a very capital efficient company, did not have a lot of employees and was able to grow really fast, et cetera. But one piece of everyone's calculation has to be that this company is valuable in part because of what it can do to a big strategic acquirer if they don't acquire it. So like Instagram, we actually have a pretty good proxy for that because they raised at a $500 million valuation and then got acquired for $1 billion 10 days later. So one of the best IRRs in venture of all time. But it was also a good measure of just here's what Instagram is worth on its own, even with a merger premium. And then here's what it's worth to Facebook, not to have to worry about an independent Instagram. So in a sense, these deals end up being a subsidy for exactly the kind of competition that we're trying to preserve. There have been interesting case studies of this. Like there was a period in the late 19th century when Western Union was growing really fast, and entrepreneurs realized that you could actually mug Western Union. You find a city that they're not connected to, you build a connection, and then you sell it for 3 times your cost. Or you find a city Western Union is hooked up to, you build your own parallel telegraph line, you start undercutting them. And of course, you have a weaker network, but on that particular area, you actually have really competitive pricing and they pay you to go away. And what eventually happens is that there is some level of market discipline for these companies where they can't, if they acquire all of their problems, they are actually creating a huge subsidy for people to just start problems for them. So eventually the companies actually have to have some kind of network effect they can take advantage of or develop some kind of cost advantage. So it does end up having this sort of net pro-consumer thing if you just leave it open to the market. Where that gets really tough is if you have high capital requirements and the capital requirements keep on going up. So it becomes harder and harder for someone to just casually put together a little business that competes with this big company. But even in cases like that, you do end up with companies that are elsewhere in the supply chain starting to cause competition. So I think Google Fiber is a really good example of this, where the US just wasn't getting really great broadband for our money, both in terms of what individuals and businesses were paying for, but also in terms of the amount of subsidies that broadband connectivity got. But Google did realize that by creating really fast, very affordable connections in a handful of places, they could basically force a CapEx cycle on the rest of the industry and force everyone else to upgrade their infrastructure. So in my view, Google got a really good return on Google Fiber by doing it in a couple of places. I actually use Google Fiber. It's great, but I don't like on a standalone basis, not Google's best investment, but in terms of what it did to the rest of the telecom space, it was actually probably a pretty good deal, although the counterfactuals are hard. But to rely on that, you are basically saying that you're going to rely less on the FTC and more on the fact that we have a bunch of ruthless monopolists, but none of them have quite gotten a comprehensive monopoly, and so eventually they kind of they exercise their ruthlessness by weakening somebody else's monopoly. And that's a kind of weird equilibrium, but it is an equilibrium that's worked pretty well. So I would lean towards let them do that. Like if what actually happened was Figma became a threat to Adobe, and so Adobe bought them, and now Adobe is going to raise the price and stop launching new features in Figma, and it's going to suck for everyone. Well, that does also mean that there's $20 billion to the next person who builds Figma, but even better, and decides to hold out and not sell for even longer and cause even more problems for Adobe.
Yeah, well put. Is it fair to summarize something along the lines of, antitrust used to be about avoiding monopolies where consumers were obviously hurt because there was price fixing or some other sort of obvious, sort of punishment to the consumer. But now they're more focused on preserving kind of broad-based competition, i.e., letting startups compete, even if it has nothing to obviously do with the consumer.
Like that is definitely Lena Khan's theory, and she's pushed that. It is kind of weird because it does mean, I guess you have to think about uncertainty and timescales. And if you say there's a wide range of uncertainty, but that the big companies probably have very coherent plans and they expect to get good returns on their money, then you can say that probably, size alone, market power alone, even if it's not being exploited, does eventually become a problem. By the time it's a problem, it's really hard to undo what's happened and really hard to fix it. So something like AWS is certainly not a monopoly. Like they have very direct competitors for a lot of their products, but they have been able to arrange pricing in such a way that it's very expensive to leave. It's a lot cheaper to keep your data on AWS, and that has created, it's a less competitive market than it otherwise would have been because of these decisions. But early on, when Amazon was setting its pricing, the price to move data off AWS was not that high. It's just they've cut prices for basically everything else and kept that price pretty high. And B, it didn't look like that critical a business. Like, hey, you can rent servers from a bookstore. What will they think of next? It just didn't seem like that big a deal. So it was kind of reasonable that no antitrust people took a close look at it. But if you do buy the idea that size alone becomes a problem, but you also recognize that companies get big because they have advantages, and often companies that get big and continue to grow, they have advantages because of their scale. So someone like Amazon, they can afford a more comprehensive network of distribution centers. They can have less inventory on hand and still be able to mostly guarantee next day and same day delivery for a huge range of products, just because they're so big. They know with high confidence they will sell X number of units of whatever it is over some known time period, so they can stock less of it and still offer it fast, et cetera. Like, if you go after companies on size alone, but those companies actually have size advantages and they're not exploiting the consumer, then you're actually doing a directly consumer harmful antitrust policy, at least in a first order sense. So if a smaller version of Amazon would be less price competitive, and Amazon right now is passing a lot of savings on to consumers, then by breaking Amazon up, you are creating a set of smaller and less efficient and therefore more expensive and slower shipping Amazons. And you might say that is actually a worthwhile trade. Like, we would rather live in a slightly poorer country that has fewer giant corporations. But if you do need to think about that trade-off. Now, again, over longer periods, maybe it is the case that every big company that has good economies of scale at some point will start exploiting them as much as possible. But in practice, it's really hard to say. And in fact, just the econometric questions around how much is Amazon actually exploiting its position, those become hard too. So Amazon is in trouble right now for charging lots of money to run ads on Amazon, ads within Amazon, and then making it basically impossible to sell products if you're not running ads. Those ads are auction-based, so you're giving up arbitrarily large shares of your gross profit to Amazon, and your competitors are all bidding against you for your keywords. And Amazon also enforces price parity across different sites. So you can't have, if you're on Amazon, you're selling something for $20 and you have to spend $8 on ads to sell that $20 product. So in theory, your cost is $8 lower on your own website. So if you sold it for, say, $15 on your own website, you would have a better deal for customers, and you'd also be making more money. But Amazon won't really let you do that. And people have argued that this is Amazon exploiting its market position. But the comparison people are making is, if you had the customer on Amazon and you also had the customer on your website, you could charge less on your website and sell the same product, and you'd get the business and you'd be fine. But Amazon's whole value prop to retailers is, we have the customer and we have a growing share of the customer, and we have given the customer this instinctive habit of just automatically opening, like, you hear about a product you want to buy, you automatically open Amazon, you smash the buy button on the first result when you search for that product, and you buy it. And it's not actually clear to me that people have a lower sales and marketing cost for getting an incremental customer off Amazon than on Amazon. Amazon's just a really efficient tool for driving demand, and they definitely charge for it. But Google's also a really efficient tool for driving demand. Google also charges for traffic, and you're not going to get any incremental traffic unless you do something extra that almost certainly has some kind of cost. So it becomes a really challenging question to even ask, are these companies exploiting things? Because you can always take this very narrow slice of the transaction and say, yes, they're definitely exploiting things. But that's true for anything. It's certainly true for any other business where there's a high fixed cost and then relatively low marginal costs. Like, people talk about this with telecoms all the time, of like, it just doesn't cost that much money to move one bit over a wire. So why are they charging this 100x markup on their marginal cost for delivering connectivity? And the answer is, they actually had to make an upfront investment, and they have to amortize that investment over their future revenues. So the incremental margin just doesn't tell you very much. And incremental margins are just going to get harder and harder to parse as the economy gets more complex and as more of it gets digitally mediated.
Yeah. If Lisa Khan came up to you and said, "Hey, Byrne, whatever you tell me to do, I will do," or if you in fact were her, is there anything else you would do differently, or you would be thinking about as you think about what's the ideal sort of framework here?
That's a really good question. I think if I'm in her position, I would look at cases where new entrants into the market have problems, and I would look at where it's getting easier and harder for new entrants to show up. I would also look at standards and at de facto standards. So things like file formats and interoperability. I think that actually makes it a lot harder for someone to get this unbeatable lead. If anyone can produce a Microsoft Excel file, then anyone can create an Excel competitor, and maybe it's a subset of functions, maybe it's a superset of functions. But if anyone can do it, then it's a lot harder for Microsoft to maintain their monopoly. And actually, Excel is a pretty good example. Like, there are good libraries out there for producing Excel files that are well formatted, that Excel can read perfectly nicely. They do exist, and for businesses where the end consumer wants to get things in Excel, and the underlying data is not initially delivered in Excel, those are a lifesaver. But they actually end up reinforcing Excel's utility as just the default tool for opening certain kinds of files and for manipulating certain kinds of data, because now it's a lot easier for everyone to produce Excel outputs, whether or not they themselves use Excel. So, like, I'm sure there's someone out there who makes their living producing Excel files, does not have an Excel license, will never have an Excel license. They're just producing the files, and that's what they do, and that makes Excel even more dominant. So I think that is it's like an important component, that you don't want companies just exploiting the fact that they have proprietary formats to get away with things, but you also want to acknowledge that sometimes the underlying product is actually pretty good, and it's redundant for there to be two different formats that are not fully compatible and have different features. I think the other thing is just, I think she should just seriously think about what the actual point of antitrust is. Like, there is the model where you're going after size, you're going after big, powerful companies and trying to cut them down to size. But if you are the federal government, then you're always a much larger, much more powerful entity beating up a smaller entity. Like, Amazon is not a small company compared to most companies, but it's a small entity in the world compared to the federal government. Like, Amazon doesn't have aircraft carriers. Amazon can't cut someone off the financial system, et cetera. So it is sort of like the antitrust model that is not consumer welfare maximizing is just like, we believe that increasing the size ratio of the biggest bully to the next biggest bully is just necessarily good. And the more we can beat down the second biggest bully, the better it will be. And I think that's fine if you really, really think that the biggest bully also has your best interests at heart and all the other bullies don't. But I don't actually think that's true. So I think the consumer welfare standard is actually a better standard, but you should also think of a sort of net present consumer welfare over time, where you just accept that there are some businesses that are naturally prone to monopoly. They have network effects, and two half-size networks are just not as valuable as the main network. And you should also acknowledge that those businesses will attract a lot of capital, and that if they have monopolies that are quasi-natural and quasi-artificial, there's just a huge amount of potential energy in breaking down the artificial part and forcing them to only have the natural part of the natural monopoly. I think maybe another thing would be just looking at keeping track of how aggressive each big monopolist is at disrupting other monopolists, and letting them alone if they're doing a decent job of disrupting one another, rather than trying to accelerate and sort of out-strategize all of them and maybe accidentally do something that's really beneficial to one of them because the nth order impact of what you're doing was not obvious.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Real quick, what's the easiest choice you can make? Taking the window instead of the middle seat, outsourcing business tasks that you absolutely hate. What about selling with Shopify? Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the US, and Shopify is the global force behind Allbirds, Rothy's, and Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Whether you're selling security systems or marketing memory modules, Shopify helps you sell everywhere, from their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. I've used it in the past at the companies I've founded, and when we launch merch here at Turpentine, Shopify will be our go-to. Shopify helps turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, up to 36% better compared to other leading commerce platforms. And Shopify helps you sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. With Shopify Magic, whip up captivating content that converts, from blog posts to product descriptions. Generate instant FAQ answers. Pick the perfect email send time. Plus, Shopify Magic is free for every Shopify seller. Businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
I want to segue to another topic that we touched on last week a little bit, but let's touch on it in a different way, which is higher education. So you wrote a bit about how higher education should be financed. But my outsider understanding is that there's a little bit of a cartel going on where demand is restricted, supply is restricted in the sense of it's hard to start a new university. You have to get accredited, and part of who determines the accreditation is the existing universities or adjacent players, and then demand is subsidized, and so by the government, basically making it easier to go to college. So it's very difficult to compete with current universities. So is that the right way of thinking about it? Do we have a cartel currently? And how do you think about how higher education is financed today? What are the problems with it? How should it be financed?
Yeah, on the cartel point, universities are probably another category where you actually do have some natural monopoly characteristics. So if you think of someone 150 years ago who is smart, they know they're smart, they want to continue to learn in some domain, like they're going to go to one of a handful of schools if they can. And the if they can thing gets really hard if you're talking about just a randomly selected American. First of all, you want this randomly selected American to be a guy. That really opens up a lot of opportunities, and it should be a white guy, a Christian guy. Like these all give them way more opportunities. But even that, like even if you assume, if you take the elements of the system that were actually pretty meritocratic and were just based on can you perform at the acceptable level or not, like if there's a handful of places that a really smart, ambitious person who wants to advance themselves intellectually should go, they go to those places. And now those places are even better places for the other smart people who really want to advance themselves intellectually to go. So you have a natural network effect from that. You have like the agglomeration effect of putting a lot of smart people together and having them all work on advancing their frontier of knowledge has these really disproportionate effects that shows up in a lot of different places. Startups and academia, even government projects sometimes, more so historically than today, but has happened. So that's hard to disrupt. And then the brand name becomes really valuable because the schools, once they are the place to go, they can start being really selective. In fact, they can sort of meme themselves into being what they were. Like Harvard sort of caught up to its historic reputation in, I would say, like in the middle of the 20th century when they started using actual standardized aptitude tests and eliminated quotas and started becoming just more academically rigorous. And also the European universities were a bit more out of the picture at that point, and you had a lot of European academics who came to America. So just had a lot of ways that the schools could actually become the intellectual elite. I think Harvard has been synonymous with American intellectual elite for a long time, but just was not incredibly challenging to get into Harvard historically, until again, like 19. Well, there was a process, and so they started getting more rigorous in the 20s and 30s, and then had some backsliding, and then you had most young men being involved in the war effort, either on the front or if they weren't, then they were probably working on something war related. So it became a lot harder for Harvard to have normal admissions. But yeah, I think Harvard lives up to its reputation better than it used to. And that tells you something. That tells you that if you didn't have the foresight to try to create this ostentatiously smart institution a really long time ago, then you have to peel off lots of really smart people from schools that actually do have a good intellectual climate to offer in many respects, and they already have a lot of smart people, and they already have the brand name. So you sort of have to get a lot of them at once. Like you have to kind of do this project paperclip style thing, or this operation paperclip style thing, where you try to find like the most free thinking 20% of each of the good schools and get them all, like give them all full ride scholarships if they all go to UATX or something, and then you get to say like, this is the like this school is actually academically comparable to any other any Ivy League school, but also, you know, you have avoided a bunch of the craziness, or you are not stuck with the negative connotations of their brand names, or you have some other benefit. I don't know what the other benefits would be, but it's a hard problem. Like it's been a long time since any school moved up to the upper echelons of the rankings, and when they do it, it is pretty opportunistic. So George Mason is actually a good example of a school that was able to move up substantially, and they basically figured out that they are near DC, and DC just over long periods, half the time Republicans are going to be in charge, half the time Democrats are going to be in charge, and so if schools tend to lean left, then if you're the one right-leaning school, it's also strategically located such that you get more access to internships or exit opportunities or more into government. Like you have to, you know, every election cycle, there's this opportunity for your students to massively leap ahead of everyone else and do really well. And actually, conservatives in academia are in this really interesting situation where they do have just massively disproportionate opportunities because they are a relative minority, and the jobs are closer to 50-50 apportionment within like government-ish jobs. So this is like people have pointed out here, if you are an ambitious law student and you're politically neutral, it's actually way better for your future to just join the Federalist Society, because most of your classmates, to the extent that they have political affiliations, are more likely to be left and right. So there's just way more competition to become a clerk for a liberal-leaning Supreme Court justice than a conservative-leaning one. So it is. I think this is an even broader meta principle, which is that anytime you have some kind of arbitrary like discrimination, whatever, at one level of a system, at the next level, the outputs of that system, the opposite actually tends to make sense. Where if there's like a really high barrier to entry, if you're in category A, and a low barrier in category B, then of the people who actually made it through that filter, the people in category A are just going to be massively more talented on average than the people in category B. And the people in category A, if people know that, those people get more opportunities. So anyway, long digression, but I would say that schools, like elite schools, are just extremely hard to disrupt, especially if you're trying to do it through the 4-year credential. And yeah, if you have a system where you can't enter a new market until your competitors all say it's okay with them, that's just not a system that's going to select for a whole lot of dynamism. But that also assumes that the 4-year degree is actually the product that everyone should compete to do a better version of. And I just don't know that that's the case. I think it's like Henry Ford's faster horse thing. I think that the most meaningful disruptor of the Ivy League schools over my lifetime has been Y Combinator, because I've read about this, that Y Combinator is like if you try to repeatedly 80-20 the Ivy League experience and say, okay, we're going to reduce the amount of time you spend, and we're going to make it even more selective. And instead of having the system where you get a better job because you went here and then you donate years later, we'll just take equity in whatever it is that you do here, and we'll also introduce you to a bunch of people who can fund your business. And we'll give you advice, but the advice won't be the main thing. Like, you will be picking up project. That's your coursework. You spend all of your time researching that thing. They have sort of replicated a lot of what those schools do when they are doing their best. And because of that, there is some level of talent attrition from Ivy League schools into YC. And I think there's also some brand attrition where being able to, like, people, it's try hard to put Harvard in parentheses after your name. Like if you were on LinkedIn and you put your name and then in parentheses it's like Harvard 09, that would just be this incredibly dorky thing to do. Like you're vaporizing most of the brand equity you got from Harvard. But putting YC22 in the name of your company or something on LinkedIn, that is actually a really good signal. It hasn't become a try hard signal yet. Even though people do ostentatiously turn down Y Combinator funding, it's still a really good brand name. It still means a lot. So they have, to the extent that the real role of Ivy League schools is identify the most talented people, introduce all of them to one another, and then put sort of the finishing touches on their education, like make sure that they can be productive members of the workforce, and then send them out in the world and do so, like have them slingshot around these other major institutions like McKinsey and Bain and Goldman and Morgan Stanley, et cetera. Like have them pass through these really high profile institutions as they make their way through the world. So YC has boiled that down and simplified it. And so now if you join YC, you are still doing the networking thing. You're still doing some of the learning things where you're doing a lot more independent study, and you're probably in an even higher quality network. So that is a long-term threat to the Ivies. I'm sure that YC wants those schools around. It's good for those schools to still do the finishing school element. It's good for some people to finish an entire program, other people to spend a couple semesters at one of those schools, realize that they have important things to do elsewhere, drop out, maybe go through YC. So it'll coexist with those for a while. But if you have a franchise that is around this one thing, like being the best at something, and then it turns out somebody else is actually slightly better at it and has a model that is better at being better and better at improving itself than your model, then in the long run, it's just a matter of time. Like the elite schools will just get gradually less elite, and there will be other options. There will be other alternatives. So one of the things I talked about in the piece on funding higher education is that we like to fund it as this bundle where you are spending 4 years ideally, although really it's more like 6, and 6 years is also the cutoff where when we measure completion rates, we do it on a 6-year basis rather than a 4-year basis, and it's like 62%. So the actual success rate for like graduating from a 4-year institution is a lot lower than you would think if you were just looking at the admissions rates. But you could break that down into smaller components, and breaking it down into smaller components is especially good because there's always this ambiguous mix with schools, with colleges, of how much of this is skills acquisition, how much of this is meeting peers, how much of this is cultivating a rich inner life and actually getting in touch with the great works your civilization has produced, and maybe potentially producing some great works of your own. It's kind of kept deliberately ambiguous because the schools want parents to feel like kids are going to get a really, really good education, where good is defined in terms of total comp when they graduate. And then the students are also told that this is going to be a pretty fun time, like it's going to be the best 4 years of your life or 6 years of your life or whatever, and you can party hard. And then, to attract teachers, they do need to say we're doing research and we are educating the next generation, and you will actually be able to talk, like someone will fall in love with Shakespeare in your class on Shakespeare, and they will always remember that class, and it will always change their life forever. So different people get told a similar story with different emphases, but you can separate some of that stuff out. So it just doesn't have to be the case that the institution, like the organization that teaches you how a compiler works and teaches you, how to think, how to reason about databases and how to model complex distributed systems, like that doesn't have to be the same institution where you start first seriously thinking about Plato. Like you could have, it's not the same people teaching those courses. Like some people will, of course, take different courses in different areas, but the schools do different things. Like they have some component that is a liberal arts degree where it's sort of what you would spend your time on if you did not have to work for a living and just wanted to contemplate. But it's also vocational training in order to get high-paying white-collar jobs. I think we can split those. I think those can be done by different organizations, and that they mean different things to different people at different stages of their lives. You could even imagine a norm that is like you finish high school, you have sufficient education to vote and pay your taxes and work some kind of basic job, whatever. You've learned how to show up on time and how to do assignments by the time they're due. So you're able to function in some kind of modern working environment. Now we're going to make you spend a year contemplating what your life should be about. And there's going to be reading philosophy. You're going to read novels. You're going to paint. You're going to do these things that really get you in touch with what you want to do with your life. And then once you've decided, that's when you start getting on some more professional track and start figuring out exactly how to do what it is that you actually want to do with your life. But it's also hard to come up with some prescribed order because some people are really, really driven and they've wanted to do the same thing for a long time. And if you give them that track, they will do that track and excel on that track. Other people are a little bit more impressionistic, or they get into one field and realize they should be in some totally different field that is in some really tangential way adjacent to it. They figure out what the actual problem they like solving is. And this happens all the time where someone, they're in some club because they think that this interest group for the club is actually their big thing, and then they realize the fun part for them is organizing events and making sure everything works. And then 5 years later they're in sales and crushing it, and they're still interested in whatever thing that group was interested in, but its main purpose in their life was actually to show them that being a well organized and gregarious person it's a skill that not everybody has, and it's valuable in a lot of different domains. So I think that there should be just a more continuous titration of knowledge into people, and you can combine that with some of the current college funding system. Like, I do think there is a case for subsidizing the acquisition of knowledge that is intrinsically valuable to people, that has these positive externalities in terms of how people live their life and how they understand problems, but that is not going to get you paid that much better. So yeah, there's just not that many jobs where there's like a Shakespeare aficionado premium, but we're in a better society if more people read Shakespeare. So yeah, there is probably a case for subsidizing that, but I think subsidizing that in a really decentralized way, where there's someone who couldn't really make a good living hosting Zoom analyses of King Lear, but now they can, and the people who actually show up to the Zoom call are really interested and have actual thoughts on this and can relate it to their lives and are actually itching to write the essay or something. I think that actually makes everyone better off. I think that just embracing the fact that attrition is high, that a lot of people don't pay attention, embracing that and saying these people should not actually be getting the credential. Like, it should be way easier to fail out, but it should also be way more okay to fail out. You should also, I think one of the measures of whether or not education policy is working is how weak is the sheepskin effect. So this is something that Brian Kaplan has talked about, that if you finish most of your degree and don't get your actual credential, that you lose something like half the wage premium. And that is really hard to explain from the skills acquisition perspective, where you're saying that you learn things over time and that your education is what made you, what makes you earn more as a college graduate from a good school than as a high school graduate. If that were the case, there should be a pretty direct, pretty linear relationship. It would be, and I've never heard of any academic program where anybody ever said that, yeah, actually half the value that I got out of this was in the last semester when finally everything clicked. And if I hadn't finished that last semester, I wouldn't have known what I was doing. No, everyone says, I learned a lot over time. There were some good courses, some bad courses. There was some 101 course that I barely got through, and now I know that material really well. There was some higher level course that was totally optional, but turned out to present some really interesting ideas to me. And that's now what I do full time. Like, for me, I had a truncated college experience. I just didn't feel like I was getting a lot of value out of it, so dropped out of 2 different schools. And I did have one course that was on raw codes. It was taught by a guy, Ling Wang, who'd actually co-written a book with codes. And it strongly affected just how I think about economics and what models I apply. I had a lot of readings that I return to a lot when thinking about different economic issues. But I think that was probably most of the value of attending college for me and the friends that I made. But that was I think second half of freshman year. So to the extent that there was going to be some sheepskin effect, I missed that, but I don't. It ends up not mattering very much.
There's a lot there that I want to respond to. It's a great points. First off, I understand the YC analogy as it relates to startups, but what do you think is the equivalent as it relates to lawyers and doctors and, like, maybe another way we put it is, like, imagine your kids going to college in 10 years or whenever they're going to go to college, or if they are going to are they going to go to college? And what's an alternative look like? How do you think the ecosystem is going to look in a decade, or when's it going to be, like, materially changed, and what could that look like?
There's not going to be a YC for doctors or lawyers, and part of the reason for that is that those are both cartel businesses where they do want to limit entry into the business, and they can. So, especially with the lawyers, like, if their whole job is parsing rules and writing rules, then they're going to be really good at coming up with rules that are advantageous to them. So it's hard to replace those, but there's room to try to route around them. One, like, I think, I guess, like, in general, it's good life advice to really push back on 18-year-olds who have an entire plan for how they will get their dream job and it can't happen until they're 25. Like, you have a lot of life ahead of you at that point and a lot of changes you will go through, and it's hard to reverse course. Getting half of an MD or half of a JD is very expensive and just not incredibly valuable. So but I think a lot of those jobs, it's just really easy to glamorize them from the outside, and they're less fun on the inside. Doctors and lawyers have, I think, pretty high divorce rates, pretty high substance abuse rates. A lot of people try to get out of those professions. They're great for some people, but I think that it's very easy to see a cultural narrative that was out of date when you saw it, and then by the time you're actually doing that thing, it's that much more out of date. And when it's not, that's in some ways even worse, because so there was in the piece that I wrote on education and financing, I had a footnote on this, that sometimes the cultural norms for a profession get established because there was some group that was very idiosyncratic and someone wrote a book about them or made a movie about them or something, and that just solidified that particular group's norms, and they became the norms for anyone with that job. So it's a lot of people who are aspiring law students will watch the movie The Paper Chase, where it's all about a guy's complicated relationship with his just brutally demanding contracts professor. And it's at this point, the movie's like 50 years old. So a lot of the professors have also seen it. And so they sort of know what the great law school professor is supposed to be like and what the great student is supposed to be like. Everyone sort of plays these roles. This also happened with, this was also revealed by law enforcement wiretaps of mafiosos, that they actually started using cliches from The Godfather after the movie came out, and they all loved the movie. So it actually became, the movie's stereotypes became more accurate because it got more widely accepted. But if you're entering some career because you've heard about it in some context where you know exactly what it's going to be like, and it sounds incredibly glamorous, you just have to know that to the extent that it actually meets your expectations, it's because everyone is LARPing because they read the same thing you read or they watched the same thing you watched, and they're just trying to bring it back. This is probably a good reason to not work in the White House, that everyone is just going to be pretending it's a West Wing episode, and it's just going to feel so weird and dated and retro and 90s. Like, if you see someone reading the Financial Times in the West Wing, you're just obligated to give them a swirly or something and tell them knock it off. Like, it was just a TV show. The writing was good, but it shouldn't have changed your life.
So say more about what you expect your kids to do. Like, what do you predict that their higher education, your kids is, I guess, a stand-in for sort of, high ambitious, smart, well-parented kids?
Thank you. I think college might be an option, but I would like it to be more of a backup option for them. I would like it to be something where if they haven't actually found a worthwhile use of their time or developed meaningful talent develop meaningful, valuable talents despite having nearly 2 decades to do so, then yes, they can go to college and should try to go to a good school. And I don't know, if you extrapolate, then they'll be borrowing ridiculous amounts of money and it'll be insanely expensive, and who knows when the school will all burn down during a protest or something. But assuming things sort of mean revert a little bit, it's still good. And it is, going to a good school is a good way to A, meet a high concentration of very smart people, and B, meet the people who have made it their life's work to understand something that you also find interesting. So you do get these really information dense conversations if you talk to someone who's literally a world leading expert on a topic that you find interesting, and they have, every idea that you suggest to them, they have heard about it. They can tell you who came up with that idea 20 years ago and what the rebuttals were and who tried it and how it worked and how it didn't, etc. And that can be very, very valuable. But these people also have email addresses, and if you actually find an academic paper on a topic you like, you read it carefully, and you have feedback that is, constructive criticism, you are probably at the 99th percentile for young person engaging with their work, inclusive of the people who are getting graded in their class. So you don't want to abuse their time, but in a lot of cases, these people are either actually part of the public sector, or they're nominally part of an entity that's not affiliated with the government, but in practice their existence is still government subsidized, so they are still either partially or entirely public servants. And so it's kind of like asking a cop for directions, which I guess people used to do before we all had smartphone apps. So like it was just kind of understood that if someone is like a public sector employee, they do sort of work for you. You shouldn't just give them random tasks, but you should assume that their job is to be helpful. And if you can actually engage with their material in a meaningful way, then it's valuable to them too. This is what they wanted to do with their lives. So you can get a lot of those benefits without actually paying huge amounts in tuition. And so that's another way to 80/20 things, is just read things by people you like, write them emails, thoughtful emails about what you read, send them the thoughtful thing that you wrote in response to the thing that they wrote, and you can get some fraction of that college experience without actually having to move, having to live in a dorm or something. So my kids, I think it's a really bad idea to over optimize for some specific hypothetical future plan, but I do emphasize to them that this, the schooling stuff, it's optional, and the better they're doing in life, the more it is just a purely optional thing. So if they, I would imagine some of them will actually go to school. Hopefully not all of them. Hopefully not all of them will finish. And hopefully it will be because the opportunity cost of going to, the opportunity cost of getting that degree from Stanford or MIT or Harvard or whatever is simply too high compared to the next best, to the slightly better options they have. And so they go do something else.
Yeah. We've been talking about how higher education, fails kids in many ways, but also K through 12, it should not be it should not be forgotten. Also, is very punishing. Is your thoughts on K through 12 that we should just have much more competition, i.e., much more privatization, and that thus we'd have more innovation there? Because it feels like we're very from the optimal, sort of solution for kids.
Yeah, definitely. I think we should, you could have like a sort of universal basic school of it, somewhere that is commutable from where you are. There is some school that will teach your kids the approximate basics, but it should be one option among many. I think that vouchers for all is probably optimal. And yes, some people will send their kids to bad schools or to schools that are fanatical on some religious or ideological axis. But there are just a lot of really, really, really absurdly bad schools within the public school system. Like it's not like we have a really good solution to the inability to teach 7th grade or 2nd grade math. Like we actually have plenty of schools that are failing to do that already. And then saying that we have to protect those parents from sending their kids to any alternative to that whatsoever is just insane to me. I think that this would be bad for teachers unions, but I find teachers unions extremely disingenuous when they talk about political issues. I think that the most egregious thing to me is just in the public discourse on teacher pay, it is like an accepted standard thing that teachers unions will quote salaries and not benefits, but teachers have extremely good benefits. They have incredible job security. There's like New York had this literal room where you could go if you were so dysfunctional. That the best thing for the entire school system was to keep you somewhere where you could be supervised and kept away from students, and you'd earn full pay. You just weren't allowed to do anything productive in the room. Like that, the fact that existed instead of just you messed up and, slugged a student because they were rude to you, and so you just instantly lose your job. That seems bad. I think people who have really good pensions and who omit the pension from their calculation of their stated income, I think the penalty for that should just be zeroing out the pension. Like, if it's not worth anything to you, I'll take it. It's worth something to me. I actually think that, periodically threatening to zero out teachers' pensions would be a useful political tool. Like, and it's, that's not like an anti-teacher sentiment. To the extent that it's an anti-teacher sentiment, that's only the case if teachers are making inconceivably more than they otherwise could doing the same work in a more competitive market, which it is empirically true that teachers are paid less, again, omitting benefits for some bizarre reason. They're paid less than other people with bachelor's degrees, but average standardized test scores for people entering schools and majoring in education are pretty much high school graduate level, like slightly above. But it is like the least academically challenging thing you can do to get what is still technically considered a bachelor's degree. So it is true they are paid less than other bachelor's degree recipients, but it's also much easier to get that bachelor's degree than others. It is also true that when teachers switch jobs, they do tend to earn less money. So teaching does pay better than other jobs with a similar set of skills. So it like they would be worse off, but I think anytime you have a politically powerful constituency that monopolizes the provision of something a lot of people find valuable, and then periodically just threatens to take it away from everybody unless they get more money, like you wouldn't tolerate that in some other business. You wouldn't be like, well, the oil and gas union has decided that we don't like oil executives enough, and so they're raising the price of gas 50%. And if you don't like it, then you can't buy gas at 85% of gas stations. Like that would be completely insane. Like if someone tried to do that once, we'd be like, this system is completely broken. Let's burn it all down and start with anything new, which will be significantly better. But in the case of monopolizing public education and then periodically abusing your monopoly power in order to extract more wealth from your customers, which I think earlier in this discussion we kind of didn't verbalize the idea that it's actually bad to do that, but I think it is bad to do that. I think it's bad to use the law to monopolize something and then exploit your monopoly ruthlessly. But it does get done. And the fact that the entities that are doing this have lots of small shareholders rather than a small number of large shareholders doesn't actually change the deadweight loss calculation at all. It just means that the benefits that are left over after you account for that deadweight loss are distributed more evenly. But I think index funds, by that argument, index funds and mass adoption of 401k should also make us more tolerant of monopolies in other areas of life. So yeah, if you support teachers unions, you should also support disbanding the FTC and allowing Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Amazon to merge into one big, beautiful tech conglomerate that controls everything.
Like the circle. It is ironic that in June 2020, after George Floyd, there was a lot of sort of scrutiny around police unions. People sort of discovered that, hey, this prevents accountability and it's harder to fire, but people didn't make the same jump as it relates to teachers unions.
Yeah, to be fair, teachers unions are involved in fewer fatal shootings. So like I could see, fewer people making that extrapolation. But yeah, in general, the idea of public sector unions is actually just kind of crazy. Like again, we're going to legally monopolize something, and then we're going to have a single vendor who provides the critical input that makes this thing work. And then the critical vendor is going to periodically just jack up prices and, reduce the quality of its work output. And there's nothing we can do. Like, it feels like a mistake you'd make exactly once, and then you'd be like, who could possibly have thought this was a good idea? This is obviously a really terrible idea. And then we'd never do it again. But yeah, those police unions, like, I'm sure at some point they served a purpose, but it really seems like, if you have a union where the whole purpose is to protect the worst of the people in your profession, and that is like it's disproportionately valuable to whoever is actually a really violent cop who abuses their authority all the time. They're going to get a whole lot more out of the union than someone who is really nice, really helpful, and just likes stopping crime. So yeah, it seems like if you have a system like that, then it's going to select for the worst people to join it, and it's just going to get continuously worse forever.
Speaking of monopolies, and maybe we'll gear towards closing on this. I think it's fair to say that universities have there's like a political, ideological monopoly. I think conservatives are less than 10% of sort of professors, or maybe even less than 5%, or on sort of, premier universities. It's a very small percentage. It's been decreasing significantly over the past few decades. To what extent is that just a natural outcome versus to what extent is that sort of, artificially engendered somehow? And do you expect, how could that change? Do you expect that to change?
On average, you should just expect schools to, you should expect people who teach for a living to be more progressive than the rest of the population. I've advanced this in a couple places, the class warfare theory of ideology, where conservatives want, what conservatives want is like a good life for someone who wants to have a normal job, get married, have a normal number of kids, go to church, etc. But to argue for that, you need some cohort of people who, instead of doing that, are going to write books and have glamorous TV jobs and live in big cities and participate in all these big debates and won't get married until they're 35, will have 1.2 children, and will probably send those children to an elite school, just like the elite school they went to. So the conservative intellectuals end up looking a lot more like progressives. They have very blue state lifestyles and disproportionately live in blue cities. And then the converse of that is to realize a progressive vision of, we're going to have healthcare, free healthcare for all and universal education and a really high minimum wage and no pollution, et cetera. Like, you need to spend a ton of money to do that, which means you need to have a ton of people who are just going to quietly work, pay their taxes, be a net contributor to the social safety net, i.e. they are going to comply with laws, not cause trouble, not have lifestyles that lead to significant medical expenses. So you basically need a majority of your citizens to have fairly conservative personal values in order to afford the progressive vision of this very broad, effective welfare state. So both sides actually need someone who acts as if they're on the other side and who is naturally aligned with the other side in order for their whole system to work. And so, yeah, it's just, if you are a conservative who wants to have this fairly conventional conservative lifestyle, it's just a whole lot harder to do it if you are teaching at Stanford for a living. You probably, if you really value that lifestyle, at some point you will leave academia, get a job in industry, and be able to afford that lifestyle, and you're no longer molding the impressionable minds of the next generation. Now, the saving grace for conservatives here is that people, you'll get really conservative when they get mugged. They get really conservative when they look at their first paycheck and look at the gross and look at the net and then ask themselves, like, am I actually getting my money's worth? And then as their pay goes up, they're like, wow, I'm really not getting my money's worth. This sucks. So people do tend to get more conservative as they age. So doesn't matter a ton necessarily. I think where it does get tricky is if you have cohorts of young people who go straight from good schools into positions of influence. And there's always this debate over, do congressional staffers wield just unfathomable influence where the person who's typing up the bill is actually more important than the senator? And I don't think that's true, but it is true that they can definitely tilt things in a particular direction, and they can choose. They have a lot of control over what information gets to the person they're working for and then what gets done on behalf of that person. So, and at one level, it's good. Like, you do want these ambitious, high energy people working as early as possible in positions of authority. It's just, it does turn out that as they get more and more progressive, that just means that you have a lot of people executing things for the government who are much, much more to the left than the person on whose behalf they're executing them for, whether it's the median voter or even the median voter who elected their particular person. So that does have a distorting effect. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, what it also means is that someone who is conservative and wants to work in DC politics, periodically they just have, a huge number of really good job opportunities, and then it goes away. There's just way less competition for them. But that's sort of, nice redistribution to conservatives, but not enough redistribution for those conservatives to be able to afford, a largish family in Washington, DC. So you sort of need people to cycle out, work in industry, become independently wealthy, and then go back to working for the government. And if there's like a 20-year gap that you spend actually making your fortune before you can be part of the political process, then that just messes up things too. But it's hard to optimize. And I think the other thing is it's getting harder for schools to be, well, it's getting harder for the more uniform political views to actually take effect, because there has been just this gradual divergence on what is a cutting edge left of center view versus what do mainstream people in this country actually think. And at some point, if your institution is left and getting more and more left, it actually starts to become so left that it's irrelevant, and whatever you do end up persuading kids is true just gets laughed off as like, well, that's what they're saying now. Who knows what they'll be saying a year from now? But either way, let's just ignore it. And meanwhile, it is a lot easier to get independent education of highly variable quality, of course, but an independent education online. Lots of old books available on Google Books. Lots of fun blogs you can read. So if your professor is very left wing and you don't like it, and you feel like their views are shallow and just don't make any sense, like you can log on and read all sorts of countervailing viewpoints, and you'd often find that those viewpoints, because they don't have the sort of monopoly economics of the school, like if someone is teaching poli-sci 101, you don't really have an option to go to a different teacher. But if they're competing online, competing for attention and competing to not get dunked on, then there is this harsher selection effect for being really good or at least really punchy. And it can be very annoying to be the token conservative in a very liberal group or the token liberal in a very conservative group, but it does tend to sharpen your views pretty quickly and tell you on what points the other side has actually pretty good arguments, on what point they're wrong and don't know it, and on what points they're actually wrong, but you can tell they all sort of realize that this is kind of crazy and they wish the equilibrium were not, and they all had to say X is true when they know X is not true. This is, of course, a completely bipartisan phenomenon. Donald Trump is like the living embodiment of very large cohort of Republicans who really wish they didn't have to say Donald Trump is just like the greatest leader this country has ever had. But they really feel like if they say that, some people will roll their eyes and continue to vote Republican, but some people will find the Trumpiest possible person who could primary them and vote for that guy instead. And the usual result of that is actually a Democrat gets elected. So for the good of the party, they have to say certain things they don't really believe at all about Donald Trump. And on the left, there's plenty of that with other things where they probably wish they didn't have to say it. They hope it becomes less salient over time, but for now, they're stuck with it.
It's interesting. Yeah, my thought is that if someone is focused on making universities more ideologically pluralistic, it's less best to compete head on in the way that UATX is, and more best to compete adjacently in terms of like the Teal Fellowship, for example, is not a career step back for anybody. It's a career advancement, whereas UATX relative to Stanford feels like a step back. And so they're selecting on like sort of free speech or desire for truth, and that doesn't necessarily win in the marketplace. Whereas like directly on career, you could then become more conservative as a benefit.
Yeah, that is. It's I think another sort of cult like class trader model here, where conservatives, because if they're starting something new, they can make it more selective by just making it really, really small. So instead of trying to replicate Harvard, you try to get 1% of the size of the student body of Harvard. And then you also get to say, if you're interested in something with a slightly higher acceptance rate, consider any elite school whatsoever. And it's, you get a nice 1-2 there. And the thing is that really only works if you're losing. As soon as your side starts winning, then you're less selective, or you're pushing, successfully pushing some kind of weird higher education affirmative action for conservatives. And I don't think that works. Like, I think the conservatives who are willing to be affirmative actioned in that way are in some really deep sense betraying the conservative norms about meritocracy. So they won't be good conservatives. And there's that phenomenon where a lot of media publications, they'll have their token conservative who seems to agree with the target audience of that publication on everything. They just get to say periodically, by the way, I am still conservative. This has happened with a few publications where they hire someone and it's very inoffensive for the readers because this person, their shtick is they're nominally conservative, but really on any high salience hot button issue, they're willing to bravely tell New York Times readers that actually the median New York Times reader is completely right about this, and they're looking at what they're talking about.
Totally. Let's wrap on that. This has been a great overview on antitrust and higher education. A great deep dive. Byrne, always a pleasure. Till next time.
Always. All right. Next time.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.